väcka dem där ute. Alldeles uppe igång. Dear friends, colleagues, a very, very warm welcome to the Swedish Defence University this Monday afternoon. My name is Robert Egnell, a professor and the Vice Chancellor of the Swedish Defence University. I would just like to say that learning from the incredibly impressive fight that we are currently witnessing in Ukraine, but also finding ways of supporting Ukraine in that fight is perhaps one of the most important things we do at the Swedish Defence University at this stage in history. That means that this seminar is absolutely spot on what we want to do, to gather experts from different fields of different experiences here at the university to discuss these important issues. Couldn't be more timely. And we are therefore so grateful to Folk och Försvar, let's not mix the languages here, for co-hosting this with us and for bringing all of you here to the university. And with that, I would like to hand over to our partner, Maud.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Maud Holma von Heine. I'm the Secretary General of Folk och Försvar, and we are delighted to co-arrange this seminar together with the Swedish Defence University. Folk och Försvar usually do several seminars during the year to enhance knowledge in the field of defense and security policy, and we share that interest in those subjects with the Swedish Defence University. And we're delighted to see so many in the audience here today, and we also have people following this on the web, either right now or afterwards, and you're all very welcome to take part in this important seminar. As Robert said, it is of utmost importance to follow what is happening in Ukraine. They fight for their sovereignty and freedom, but also for the security order that Europe relies on. So it is important not to forget, but to still follow what is happening in Ukraine at the same time as several other conflicts are in focus. We must not forget this. We are delighted also we're honored to have several distinguished analysts and experts with us today to discuss these matters, and especially a warm welcome to our international speakers who are taking their time to come here and share their views with us. So, once again, a warm welcome, and with that, we hand over to Pasi Hoikuri, who will moderate the seminar today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maud. My name is Pasi Hoikuri, and I'm the Program Manager for Security Policy at Folk och Försvar. I want to start by thanking Professor Ford, whom I've had the pleasure to organize and plan this event with. You will have the honor of listening to him a bit later. More than 2.5 years have passed since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war has featured both traditional warfare, such as massive use of artillery and tanks, as well as the use of modern technology, such as smartphones and drones. In parallel to traditional warfare, information technologies have launched an information war, in which both state and non-state actors spread competing narratives and combat propaganda. New technologies therefore add a complex layer to the ongoing war and imply new challenges on the battlefield. The war in Ukraine has had significant repercussions on the European security order, leading Sweden, as you all know, to seeking and becoming a member of NATO. Ukraine has received various kinds of support in the form of material from the European Union, the US, among others. How has this impacted the war, and what does it mean for the long-term situation on the ground in Ukraine? What are some of the lessons learned from the war? As we have seen in Ukraine, the internet will not be switched off in wartime. The use of smartphones permits citizens to stay instantly updated on current events, but also provides unprecedented opportunities to record and document scenes and evidence from the war and share information in real time. This digital warfare highlights a new dimension to the war and blurs the lines between civilians and combatants. In addition, private technology such as Starlink and state-affiliated private companies such as the Wagner Group have also played a role in the war. Autonomous weapons and the continued development of artificial intelligence emphasize the importance of discussing and understanding the future of warfare, including how conventional and new technology can interact. These developments impact not only countries such as Ukraine, but also has global effects. What will the new battlefield of tomorrow look like? How will artificial intelligence impact the future war? And how will the development of non-state actors be in the future? These are all enormously difficult questions to answer. This seminar aims to discuss and deepen our understanding in some of those areas. With us today, as we just heard, we have several eminent speakers from Sweden, the United States, and the United Kingdom who will share their expertise. We will start this seminar in just a few moments by listening to the first panel, where we have Jack Watling, who's a senior research fellow on land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, Karolina Wendel-Palin, who's the deputy research director for Russia and Eurasia at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and Dara Massicott, a senior fellow at the Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They will, in a moment, be given each 10 minutes to make the remarks, and after that, we will have a discussion between the participants. After the first panel, we will shift the focus towards the future warfare and begin the second part of the seminar by remarks from Professor Matthew Ford, who will give an overview of the future of warfare and its implications. The seminar will conclude with a panel discussion focused on the digital battlefields of future wars. And in that panel, we will have the pleasure of listening to Kristin Ljungqvist, Associate Professor of War Studies here at the Swedish Defense University, Hanna Lindestål, CEO at Earhart Business Protection Agency, Carl Fredrik Wettermark, who's the Senior Director at the National Security Council at the Prime Minister's Office, and Joachim Paasikivi, an independent defense analyst. With that, I hand over to Jack for his introductory remark in the first panels.
Thank you very much. So I have been asked to address the question of the current dynamics in Ukraine and what is likely to happen, or the challenges that we face over the next, let's say, 8 months. I'm going to cover that in 3 parts. The first, very much focused on the problem set that we're addressing now. The second, on the operational problems that we need to solve. And the third, on the longer-term implications of whether we solve those problems or not, essentially. In terms of the current dynamic, I think it's important to understand the scale of the existing fight. We are seeing a force of around 400,000 Ukrainian troops fighting an invading army of around 510,000 troops, with more troops fighting in Kursk. That is being fought along a front line that is around 1,000 kilometers long, and Ukraine is being engaged, as is Russia, throughout their operational depth, including strikes as far away as Murmansk. And so when we think about the battle space, it is vast. Very often, when we are looking at videos or snapshots from the conflict, we are looking at very, very small tactical instances. But those are happening all over Ukraine all the time. And so when we understand the problems that are being faced and why there is sometimes a disconnect between the narrative portrayed in those videos that are brought from the front versus the dynamics of the fighting, it is that actually both sides are largely fighting company battles. That's about the size of the engagements most of the time. Each company is probably occupying around 3 kilometers of front. And what we are seeing is a dynamic where the Russians are able to apply pressure across the entire front simultaneously. Not at equal levels of intensity, but nonetheless, they are forcing Ukraine to actively defend the entire front line. In many instances, the Russians use troops that they consider to be at a lower level of readiness to go and continuously skirmish with the Ukrainians, to keep them in their fighting positions and expose themselves, exhaust themselves, use up their ammunition. And at the same time, we are seeing up to 25 to 50 UAVs per 10 kilometers of front operating in tactical depth over the fighting positions. The videos from those UAVs are available to most echelons, so you can have simultaneously the enemy at multiple echelons watching your fighting positions. And when they see opportunities, they will apply artillery fire, drones, or other effects to be able to attrit the force. We also have up to 1,000 to 1,500 Russian reconnaissance drones flying deep inside Ukraine every day. There's usually around 5 over every single tactical ground line of communication going to a fighting position. And so when movements along those ground lines of communication are detected, that allows them to be engaged with artillery. Now, on the Ukrainian side, there is an increasing shortage of artillery pieces. There is continuous limitations on the availability of ammunition as we push in ammunition in relatively small but continuous packages. And so as the Ukrainian levels of equipment have reduced early this year, that meant that they had to rely on direct firepower to try and hold parts of the front. More people had to be pushed forward. That meant that they had a greater density of forces, and therefore, with the Russians dropping 500 to 1,500 kilogram aerial bombs, glide bombs, onto the fighting positions routinely, we are seeing an increase in Ukrainian casualties. That means that for the last probably 8 months, Ukrainian losses have been higher than their ability to replace forces. And so we have seen the thinning out of the line. And that is why you are now seeing relatively poor in terms of the quality of their battle drills and experience, Russian units making incremental progress across the entire front. They are working into the seams of the Ukrainian positions. Now, as that situation protracts, it is going to become harder and harder for the Ukrainians to keep plugging the gaps. Their reserves are already very thin, and the risk is that at some point the dam breaks, right? That they are not able to hold sectors of the front, and therefore the Russians can push forward relatively unopposed on some axes. That is the risk. The reason I highlight this is that there are a series of problems we need to solve if we are to end that dynamic. The first is we need to reduce the pervasive observation behind Ukrainian lines. They can't do it with traditional air defense anymore because there are not enough interceptors. And actually, the dominance of ISR in depth means that the Russians are using Iskanders to knock out air defense that's brought forward. If you can't remove that pervasive ISR, and there are technologies that can do it, it's not about what the solution is, it's about the scale at which it can be pushed in and enabled. If you can't do that, then you can't gain a lodgement for your artillery. And without your artillery, you are going to have more people in the fighting positions. And so we have to be able to create conditions for the artillery to be survivable. If we can do that, we can significantly increase the number of casualties the Russians take and ultimately slow down their rate of advance. The reason why that is critical is to move into that second area of consequences. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about negotiations. It would be very, very bad to be pushed into negotiations in a situation where the Ukrainian armed forces are steadily and potentially more rapidly losing ground. You risk ending up in something like a Brest-Litovsk scenario, right? Where the Germans had the Soviets in a position where whenever the Soviets tried to hold a negotiating position, the Germans would simply advance until the position was changed. And that is, if we get into negotiations with that dynamic, we will end up in a situation where Ukraine is not able to terminate the conflict on favorable terms that enable its sovereignty. And so we have to stabilize the front. And that means the continuation of provision of counter-ISR capability, electronic warfare, interceptors, radar. The provision of artillery and ammunition is critical. The provision of protected mobility is critical in terms of being able to have ambulances, resupply in those contested ground lines of communication, and direct firepower in contact to support the troops. Those are all vital things. The Ukrainians need to resolve issues with their recruitment and training pipeline. That is something we cannot do for them, and that's on them. But those are solvable problems. And if they can be solved, then frankly, the Russians do not have the capabilities to execute rapid breakthrough and exploitation operations. And so the Russians are also on a timeline. At the moment, the level of attrition means that things are trending in Russia's favor, and that's why they are taking a very hard line. But actually, if we get through next year, then the Russian armed forces are going to start running into some pretty critical shortages. Their stockpiles will be heavily depleted. Their production of new equipment will not meet the loss rates. And therefore, leverage will start to swing back the other way, especially if they are not making progress on the ground. And so protraction ultimately can favor Ukraine, but we have to set up the conditions for that to be the case. And the critical question is whether the Kremlin perceives time to be in their favor. If they don't, then we can start setting up negotiations where we can enforce a conclusion to the conflict, which creates the space for a favorable set of terminations to the conflict. The underpinning requirement for that is security guarantees, because ultimately, in the long run, Russia has a fully mobilized war economy. That is going to be the case for some time. It has sustained hostile intent. And so even if we manage to freeze or end the conflict on terms that are favorable to Ukraine and preserve its sovereignty, the only way that the Ukrainian economy and direct investment will be protected or enabled is if people have confidence that the war is not going to break out again in a couple of years. And the only way that happens, because Ukraine will not be able to afford the level of mobilization that it currently has, is if they have firm security guarantees from their international partners. Now, that's not the same as NATO membership, but it also probably means that several countries in NATO, particularly in European NATO, need to come forward and make a serious proposition to Ukraine. That is going to be challenging because with the US increasingly fixed in the Indo-Pacific in terms of the military balance, Europe will not be able to make those guarantees credible to Moscow without pretty substantial investment in our own defense industries. You can have the most capable forces in the world, but if you are running out of ammunition, then they will not be able to preserve their positions. And so my final point, as I'm hitting the limits of my time, is that now is the time when we have to invest for our own security, for Ukraine's survival, and ultimately to deter Russia. If we do not make those investments, then we will be looking at deteriorating options, and we will be more constrained in what we can put on the table. We will be ceding leverage. And so the one commodity that we cannot sacrifice or be complacent about at this point is time. And with that, I will hand over to my colleagues to broaden the discussion.
Carolina?
Thank you. I was asked to focus on the one hand, internal developments inside Russia, its future strategy, but also the implications for Sweden and Europe. So it's a rather wide remit for 10 minutes. But I'll start to say a few words about Russia's domestic politics and its economy, the recent budget, but also the impact of the war on Russian society and Russian politics, and what is a most likely future Moscow strategy in Ukraine, but also against the West. And finally, I'll try to say a few words about what this means for Europe. Jack has already, I think, spelled out this out, and for Sweden in particular. So, on Russia's politics and its security outlook, I think I've been in so many panels where I've talked about increased repression, secrecy, and censorship, political power that takes an ever deeper interest in not just how you vote, but also in what you read, what music you listen to, even what you do or do not do in your bedroom. And this all takes place under a banner of Russian traditional values. Women should give birth to the future soldiers. Russia is planning for the next 18 years. Books that are considered dangerous in Russia today, they are sold in plastic with warnings as if it was tobacco. And also, this is the logic behind the Russian effort to build a sovereign internet, to try and control what information is available to the Russian population in what they define as a Russian segment of the internet. And they're putting resources into this policy. There's increasing nationalism in Russia, although they insist on calling it patriotism. And this is visible not least in the way they are treating immigrants from Central Asia today. Because war changes countries, and Russia has changed in these 2 years. We've just seen a budget presented in Russian parliament that devotes more resources to this war and to Russian defense than ever since 1991. You're going to see a number of different estimates of just what the burden on Russia's economy is in terms of share of GDP, but it's a substantial burden for the Russian economy. And on the other hand, this is also what keeps the Russian economy going. That's why we see economic growth in Russia right now. So what does this tell us about Russian strategic priorities? Well, for both of the areas that I've covered here, it will be difficult to roll back developments. If Russia was to try and lift repression, they could have a political crisis on their hands. And domestic security is just as important as military security for Russia. And trying to roll back the expenses that are now poured into the defense industry and also in paying Russian soldiers and their families would probably lead to an economic crisis, and by continuation, a political crisis. And this is what the Russian political leadership abhors. This leads me to the conclusion that Russia's policy course is one that is neo-imperial in form and content, and it will remain in place. And this is not least because of domestic security concerns. The survival of Putin's political system is at the heart of Russian security policy. It's locked in a long-term confrontation with the West and with Western civilization, its values and institutions. This will not go away. And when Putin talks today about this, he makes it absolutely clear that the West is evil. It has always sought to undermine Russia. He has his own version of history of how the West has always tried to attack Russia, Swedes and Poles in the 15th and 16th centuries, France in the 19th century, and Germany in the 20th century. And this is all clumped together, all of these invasions, as Western invasions of Russia in the narrative today. Ukraine will remain key to Russian security because that's the key for them to claim for a sphere of interest. So that is the goal. They want to control all of Ukraine politically, preferably without having to stage another military invasion. And that's why they insist on demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification. Jack, you spelled out that we need to provide credible security guarantees, and that's what you do in terms of making practical preparations. You have to have command structures and everything in place. You have to have reserved resources. This is what will impress Russia. Because a demilitarized Ukraine will not be able to defend itself. And when Russia talks about denazification, it's about Moscow telling Ukraine what president is allowed to sit in Kiev. You also talked about how Russia is forging ahead right now in Ukraine, and I think this boosts Russian morale right now and their confidence. I think also we need to understand that Russia is learning. They're not idiots. They're learning how to fight this war. And this is why they're feeling confident. They're convinced that history, time, and justice is on Russia's side. And Russia is forging ahead into a historic past under Putin. Everything is very much about history, the right history, the one that the Kremlin decides. And so finally then, what are the consequences for Europe in general and for Sweden? and our region. Well, as I said, this challenge from Russia is long-term. It's at the core of how they interpret the world and Russia's place in it. They're convinced that Western influence in Russia and its sphere of interest will lead to turmoil and to political chaos inside Russia. And the sooner we realize just how long-term this challenge is, the sooner we can draw the right conclusions that I think Jack spelled out eloquently. Russia has been vocal in threatening Sweden and Finland with military technical measures in our region. I think this is an intentionally vague term that Moscow uses. In practice, their position in Northern Europe is weaker today than it was before 2022. The unintended consequence of the war, that Finland and Sweden joined NATO, has made this particular theater of war for Russia, the Baltic region and the High North, even more challenging than it already was. And just how much military power Russia will be able to muster in our region will depend on the war. Right now, they have to devote all their resources to Ukraine. But I find it very difficult to see any other future than one where we have a contact line running through Europe, not just through Ukraine or on the border of Ukraine, but also along a new military border between Russia and Europe. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Darrell?
Hello, everyone. Is my mic working? Okay, great. Thank you both for your excellent remarks. It's hard to follow such excellent work. I've been asked to look forward into the future and how the Russian military plans to regenerate and recover from all of its losses that it has sustained in Ukraine. It's an interesting time to write about this topic because the Russians have not yet fully, I think, determined what they want that future force to look like. So in doing this analysis, I note that we are on the cusp of that announcement. I think we can look forward to it next year. The Russians will announce a 10-year program. So what I did in my analysis was think about 3 different areas of recovery and reconstitution, and that's Russia's ability to repair equipment, build new equipment. Number 2, at the often overlooked side, which is what is happening with the personnel. How will Russia recruit future soldiers, given everything that has happened so far? How will it retain some of the people that it has in the military right now, and what will it do with those that they don't want to return home to Russia because of what they've done? And the third category is how does Russia retain the proficiency and the learning that we're seeing in Ukraine? How do they bring it home, ingest it, disseminate it, and then use that for the future force? So those are the three topic areas I'll say a little bit about today. And I think when I was doing this research, a theme that was very consistent, and Carolina touched on it, was how many political constraints there are on the Kremlin that is influencing its behavior in this war, and I think it will influence its behavior moving forward. And there's something that is just as important, and arguably more important than this war in Ukraine, and that's maintaining control and maintaining stability in Russia. And it influences how this leadership is moving forward. How is Russia keeping the war machine fed now? It's doing so without setting the economy fully on a wartime setting. It's moved pretty far in that direction, but there's more that they can do, but it comes at a cost that they're not willing to pay right now. They're repairing on-hand equipment that's damaged in Ukraine. They're getting assistance with Belarus. They're also pulling from their Soviet stockpile, and that's the majority of the equipment that is going into Ukraine right now, a large majority. And we can see it from satellite imagery on space, how quickly they are drawing down that Soviet legacy. And I would argue with the economy they have, with the defense industrial base they have right now, they will never have that legacy again. So once this Russian army has been damaged, now they're working through destroying what remains of the Soviet army, or the ghost of the Soviet army, I suppose we could say. They're also importing ammunition and certain classes of weapons from abroad. This was very critical to them in the late months of 2022 and the early parts of 2023 from their partners in North Korea and Iran. They received artillery. They have received the Shahed drones, which they have used to great effect, and now they've purchased that intellectual property and are building them in Russia. They are offering lucrative salaries and wages and social benefits to Russian soldiers, more than we've ever seen. And the salaries that they're offering them right now, which is well beyond 200,000 rubles a month, plus all the benefits on top of that, that puts those wages in the top 10% of Russian wages. It's not only just double the national salary. If you look at the distribution of salary, it's in the top 10%. This is now an upper middle class income. So it is appealing to people in some of the regions, and somewhat discouragingly, it's encouraging their families to encourage the men to go fight. But it's not necessarily a good news story for Russia's war effort, and I note that apart from drone production and unmanned aircraft, their production has actually plateaued. It is plateauing or it's flatlining in terms of how many people they're getting in every month to join this war effort, and it's plateauing in terms of how many tanks that they can produce. And they're reaching this limitation within the capacity of the factories. It's not easy to change that at this point. They're running 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day. They're using prisoner labor as well. For them to fundamentally increase that or change it, they will have to make policy decisions and activate additional authorities that will affect its economy even more so than now, its labor market, and critically, their population's engagement with this war. The Kremlin wants the Russian population to remain disengaged at best, and apathy is okay. That's an okay outcome for the Kremlin. Thus far, the Kremlin's political calculus has constrained them from taking these steps because they're worried about the economy, they're worried about the backlash. So I just want us to keep these things in mind as the Russians throw out words like, I'm going to increase my military to 1.5 million billets. I'm going to increase my military spending 25% per year. There are significant constraints that exist in the mind of the Kremlin leadership that is going to influence the pace of this reconstruction. And we should always follow actions and not words. So I think the Russian leaders have a few options before them at this time to reconstitute the force, however long that takes. It could take up to a decade. For some types of equipment, they could be shorter, but things have to work pretty well, starting now, for them to repair themselves in a timeline shorter than a decade. Oversight is the problem. Finances are somewhat of a problem. I note that the increase to the defense budget sounds large, but I think it's mostly to keep the war effort going. So 6 to 8% GDP, depending on who you ask, 25% increase per year. That's enough to keep the wages high. It's enough to keep the war churning. It is not quite enough, in my opinion, for rebuilding the army, rebuilding the airborne. That probably requires a large lump sum payment like we saw them do last year. And the question for me, and I'm not an economist and I am often in awe of them, it's a very important skill. Where will they get this money? How will they finance it? How will they arrange such a large sum to do this? So the choices before him, I try to think about it in 2 pathways. If domestic stability and maintaining the economy and preventing it from spiraling out in terms of inflation are more important than rapidly rebuilding the military as quickly as possible, I think we're going to see the current capacity level continue. Russia will continue to turn out what we're seeing right now, and all of it will be going to Ukraine. If the war in Ukraine freezes or ends, then that equipment, they will begin to backfill it, I suspect, in Western Europe first. On the border of Finland, I think, is a priority to make a point. The Finns are prepared for this, they're waiting for it, and they don't think it's real unless there's actual people at those bases and not just the equipment. I think that if it becomes important for the Kremlin to rebuild as fast as possible and they make changes, there's signposts that we will be able to tell. That means things like constructing new factories. That means involving Russian women more in the armed services and the Russian defense industrial base. Currently, Russian women are prohibited from many types of jobs because they think it's negative for their fertility to work with certain types of metals and chemicals. We could see them do things that historically they have not wanted to do, like purchase equipment from a country like China. They have never wanted to do that. I think that is so far away from where they are right now, they would want to avoid doing that if they can. And I think about all the pressures that are emerging within the Russian budget to fund this, and there are serious problems. Russia has to make choices between social spending and spending for the military. So far, they're choosing the military, but eventually they're going to have to balance that. We've seen them balance it in the past. When they go through several year cycle of funding the military, they will compensate by reducing and increasing social spending. Within the defense budget itself, there is significant pressure. What do they spend their money on? Recruiting people, retaining people who are now accustomed to high salaries. That's very expensive. Or do they use it to buy missiles, more launchers, procurement? And then even within that, even if they invest in procurement, there's significant constraints and challenges between what they use to spend for the Russian army and the airborne, which are destroyed. And they have to receive the lion's share of support. So who will pay the price? Well, in my view, I think it's the Russian Navy. I think they will see many of their platforms delayed. And then the final point I want to make is, and we've both of the panelists have touched on this, the Russians are learning, they are adapting in this war. I see those cycles compressing, where it used to take a few months for them to see something and learn. Now we're seeing it compress down into a week or two. But most of the adaptations are very specific to the war for survivability, lethality, as you would expect from a war of this duration and this intensity. The question will be, what do they do after? And I think they will probably go back to World War II as an example for how to do this. It's a template that's available to them. I don't know how exactly it will play out. And so much depends on the political climate, yet again, in Russia. Will they be empowered and given the space to describe honestly and frankly what went wrong, what did we do well, what did we do poorly, or will we continue to see this oppressive political environment where no one will take blame, no one will accept blame, no one will even talk about the problems? That can disrupt the learning, and it can make it come out, in the American phrase, sideways. Right now, I don't see how it's possible with President Putin still in the Kremlin for him to carve out that space, to let them fully analyze, digest, and disseminate and rapidly transform. But if there is a change in leadership, and eventually there will be, then we could see that learning. And I think we have to look to today's lieutenants, today's captains, majors, those field grade officers have had a very different experience in life than some of the senior commanders in the Russian hierarchy. So they will take that experience with them. They will take that confidence that Carolina was talking about, because they do believe they're fighting NATO intelligence, NATO weapons. They will take that on board with them as they become senior officers. And they will also take on board with them the brutality that they have seen, they have participated in, or they've not stopped. And that is a part of their culture now. It arguably always was, but now it's everywhere, and particularly in the army. And so we will have to contend with a Russia that is damaged from this war psychologically. We will have to contend with a Russia that is very aggressive. And I think this is a generational challenge. And they're already thinking about the future, not just 5 to 10 years from now, but 18 years from now. And they're focusing on Russian children. So this is a long-term challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I start with you, Jack, we've seen the Ukrainian advances in Kursk. We know that they've taken forces away from the eastern flank. Experts, yourself included, pointed to the moral and political victory striking inside of Russia. Do we see Ukraine digging in Kursk? And how do you see them handling reinforcement and logistics? What do you see for Russian response against the Ukrainian forces?
So the Kursk operation was launched with 4 objectives. The first was to show Ukraine's international partners that if properly equipped, you can conduct offensive operations against Russia, right? Because the narrative had become, Ukraine's never going to do another offensive, this is all going in one direction from now on. And Ukraine wanted to show that actually the Russians can be outwitted, you can have an effect. And I think they succeeded in doing that. The second thing they wanted to highlight, really, was that they were able to seize ground so that if they were forced to negotiate, and they were in a situation where a new US administration was saying, you have to talk or we're pulling the plug on aid, that they would go into those talks with something that the Russians have to get back in those negotiations. And so long as they're able to hold it at that point, then they are actually able to leverage it for concessions. That's the concept. Of course, the problem then is you have to actually hold the ground. And so the third objective was military, which was to essentially pull Russian forces away from the Donbass. That objective did not work. We can debate about whether there have been some units committed there that would otherwise have been further committed into Donbass, but there hasn't really been a diminution of pressure in Donbass. The problem is for the Ukrainians that having launched that operation, they now face exactly the same tactical problems that they do everywhere else in terms of what I was describing about those overlapping Russian capabilities. But they have actually created a salient that is politically now vital ground for them. They have to hold it. Otherwise, it doesn't have any of those advantages in a negotiation. And so that means they can't cede the terrain, irrespective of whether it's defensible or not. And in addition, that is now a high-intensity active part of the front they are having to resource, even though prior to launching the operation in Kursk, they were short of resources to hold the front. And so it has exacerbated the tactical challenges that they were facing elsewhere. How does it pan out? I think it's going to be very difficult. You talk to the Ukrainian units that are operating there, and there was a huge moral uplift for the troops to be on the move again, rather than just being in defensive positions, being shelled. But it is costing them. And the other thing that's worth noting is that it's costing them key equipment that could have been built up for offensive operations next year, or could have been used for a maneuver defense. So when the Ukrainians are saying they want to generate more brigades, they're now expending significant amounts of materiel in order to be able to conduct this operation. And that will limit their options next year. Now, they're facing really hard trade-offs, right? And the political leadership made a decision. So it's controversial in Ukraine, but it wasn't like they were in a great position before. So I wouldn't be overly critical, except to highlight that we still have to reinforce them with material. That ultimately gives them more options. That dynamic hasn't changed.
Carolina and Dara, you both mentioned he values domestic stability over almost everything else. And you talked, Carolina, about he thinks of an 18 years from the crib till you're an adult. When you look at the domestic stability in Russia, do you see it crumbling anywhere? You mentioned a few regarding the economy there, but what does Ukraine do to undermine that domestic stability? Is it even possible? Have you seen any cracks when it comes to domestic stability?
First of all, I would say that let's not pin our hopes on Russian protests and turmoil. The Russian political leadership has become very skilled in managing politics. It has a number of tools for doing so. And I sometimes think that we end up talking about this because we don't want to make the practical preparations that we should be making and the investments that we should be making and supporting Ukraine the way we should. There are a number of things that are troubling for Russia, just as Dara said. High inflation is one of them, of course. Labor shortage. I mean, it's become very lucrative to sign a contract to become a soldier. but also to work in the defense industry. The civilian industry is struggling. And you see an increase in productivity, but it's not, no, you see an increase in production, but not in productivity. And that's a problem for an economy. I'm not an economist either, but. So they do have problems. I think another thing that they're scared of is if you have protests in certain regions that have paid a high price in this war. So they're monitoring all of this very closely. I think the one thing that would be difficult for the Kremlin would be if you saw all of these crises coming together. So let's not pin our hopes on one specific factor.
There.
It's hard to follow. Hard to follow that. That was a great answer. But when I think again about the trade-offs, they're having shortages in the defense industrial base and other parts of the civilian sector, but yet they don't change the laws that ban women from around 300 positions or types of jobs they're just not allowed to occupy. Why? Because fertility and having children is more important for the Kremlin right now. Okay, fertility and having children is more important. What are you doing to support Russian women in that regard? Well, they've decriminalized many forms of domestic violence to make the threshold higher for going to jail, for committing domestic violence against your partners. And the same people are asking, why are Russian women not having children? And they don't see these connections. In terms of any near-term things to disrupt the domestic stability, that's harder for me to see, but I do see long-term problems, specifically during demobilization. Whenever and however this war ends, whether Russia considers it a success, an abject failure, or somewhere in between, these men are going to come home and they're going to tell the story about what they did, what was done to them. And I think that's a really dangerous moment for the Kremlin, and they're going to have to manage that. I think they're already thinking about how to manage that period very closely to prevent that social instability from coming out.
I have two things as well. I think one challenge that the Kremlin stands before is the fact that this is an aging political leadership. And I'm not just talking about Putin, I'm talking about the inner circle of the Security Council. And in any personalistic authoritarian system, succession is always a weak point. The minute Putin points at someone as his successor, it becomes dangerous for him. So he will not be able to do that.
Dara, in a book called The War in Ukraine from this spring, you wrote that a strategy based on attrition or punishment had this far not worked, and that a more effective strategy would be one based on denial that could prove more effective. You mentioned long-range strike weapons to target Russian regeneration capacity, air defenses, counter-drone technology. Have we seen a shift towards targeting platform instead of forces, or does it look similar now to before? We know that Russia has moved platforms away from range, but have you seen that shift you talked about?
Yes, and that's an actual bright spot. When faced with preserving people or preserving platforms like fighter aircraft and ships, Russia always chooses to save the platforms. So we've seen them use the labor that they have in assault detachments, and they take very high casualties. That it doesn't bother the Russian general staff. It doesn't. And I don't think that it is bothering the Russian population at this point either. They've become incredibly calloused and apathetic towards the deaths because they view the people who are now participating as those, well, they signed up to do it. They are mercenaries. And this is going back to like the late 80s, 1990s, how they viewed volunteer armies. They viewed them as mercenaries. That was part of the ideology at the time. But we have seen with the Ukrainian precision strike, whether it's drones or their own organic missiles, Russia has pulled back the fleet from Crimea. They've now based it out of Russia. They've pulled back their fighter aircraft from Crimea and parts of Russia, and they've backed them up. So they are sensitive to these kind of stimuli. And I think with additional precision strike, we can back them up farther or start to attrit some of their logistics and make operations harder. But just to counterpoint, the Russians have become very effective at jamming and shooting down a lot of precision strike assets, whether that's American-made or otherwise. So it's not going to be easy.
Yeah. Jack, you mentioned that Ukraine needs artillery, they need ammunition, radar, counter-ISR. If you look at the European political landscape now, do you see those measures being taken into account, that Ukraine is going to need artillery and ammunition? Do you see the political resolve from your perspective?
I see a lot of rhetoric, and then generally a failure to translate rhetoric into production. Actually, I see quite a lot of capital, quite a lot of money, but very often there is an unwillingness to engage in regulatory change that is necessary. There is a strong desire to kind of just let the market determine what makes sense for defense companies to invest in and not, without actually putting enough money up to make it financially sensible for defense companies to increase production. So often what we see is just the order book getting longer and the delivery date getting later, but an expansion in production not happening. You'll notice that the EU is now kind of congratulating itself on how much of the 1 million rounds have ended up in Ukraine that they said they were going to acquire. Ask around about how many of those rounds were bought off the international market at very highly inflated prices because there's so much demand, versus how many were actually made, let alone made in Europe. And the answer is quite embarrassing. And so, you know, there are some European companies that are increasing production, and we're getting there. But it has been far, far too slow, you know, and what really annoys me is that we have the money to do this. We have the knowledge to do this, right? We have the expertise, we have the capital, but we've sat on our hands for far too long. And so the real question is, are we serious? You know, the fact that the joke always used to be Russia's not that big a problem because its economy is just the size of Italy, right? And it's like, okay, well, why is it outproducing the whole of NATO in terms of munitions at the moment, right? That shouldn't be the case when you look at our economies, and it doesn't have to be. So I think essentially we need to bring nitrocellulose production back into our, you know, supply chain that we control. We need to set up powder plants and allow the regulation for those to be set up, rather than having not in my backyard attitude saying, well, I won't have an explosive factory in my neighborhood. You know, that needs to be put in place and the regulation needs to go through. And then you need filling capacity, forging capacity. It's all doable, but at the moment, not enough.
Just reached the end of the panel, but if you, all three of you, say a few words, how do you see the rest of the year going, looking into 2025? I'm thinking about the Russian military, Ukrainian military, how the domestic situation is in Russia. Do you see any flashpoints in the coming year, Dara?
Well, I can tell you what Russia's objectives are. And I think we should be prepared that they will try to resource them. They first are going to try to attack a city in eastern Ukraine called Pokrovsk, and it's a very important city. It's not the only important place, but that's an objective. I think also we need to be prepared this winter that Russia will accelerate its attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They're already reduced by a significant amount. Most Ukrainian citizens experience brownouts or blackouts. Well, I think that's on the table again. And you know, from Washington's perspective, the supplemental aid that was delayed last year, it will probably run out at some point in the winter, early winter of next year. I don't see any political movement at this point, 1 month before the US presidential election, to try to backfill that. And there's a real operational cost to it. We know that from last year. So maybe that will happen after the election, maybe it won't. So I see these a series of events that, and then there's the Kursk operation and how the Russians resource the response there. I see 4 potential bad news coming in succession, and I think that we should be prepared proactively to counter that and help the Ukrainians counter those things. And right now, I'm concerned that it's drifting, and we're not. That's my concern.
Carolina?
Well, I don't see any big changes happening inside Russia. I think we'll see more of the same this year out, certainly. Perhaps the pressure on the economy will be mounting, but as a rule, Russia will just hand over the costs on the economic burden on its population. And I don't see a strong protest movement or anything like that inside Russia. When it comes to consequences for our region, we'll see more talk about military technical measures and threats. I think we should be level-headed when we hear those threats, because Russia is weaker in our region militarily. And they will take note if we make military preparations, if we actually invest in our militaries. That's one of the few ways, I think, of getting inside the Russian decision-making cycle.
Jack, final words?
I think my final observation would be that this is really the most dangerous point, because we are in a situation where Ukraine has done better than any of us dared hope. But if we don't manage to resource resolving this conflict in a way that preserves Ukraine's independence, then the whole thing can unravel, right? And a lot of investment and time and effort can end with an extremely tragic outcome that wasn't necessary. And so we still have agency, and it's important that we exercise that agency to bring about an outcome which is favorable to us and to Ukraine.
Thank you so much for participating in this panel. A big thank you from the room. And with that, I welcome Matthew Ford to the podium for his remarks about the future of warfare and its implications before we head into the second panel.
Well, good afternoon. I'm not sure how to follow that. That was an excellent series of talks and a very sobering hour or so, focusing on some of the very real challenges of mobilizing society for the purposes of fighting a conventional war in Europe. One of the things I've been asked to do is to broaden the discussion a little bit and try and act as a bridge between the very detailed commentary that was made here and the panel that follows, which is going to be more focused very much on Sweden. And you'll notice in the title of our panels, we're talking about digital warfare as much as things associated with very conventional and kinetic type activities that the guys so effectively described. The central thing here is I think that much of the way we come to know and understand what's going on in Ukraine, at least unless you have been actively going back and forth and engaging with Ukrainian armed forces, is typically that we are watching what's going on via digital devices, via our smartphones, via computer. Maybe you're mixing mainstream media with social media, and all of those things give you some insight as to how the war in Ukraine is unfolding. But this war is the most documented war in history. An NGO watching the war unfold in Syria over the 10-year civil war identified that there were around 40 years worth of footage that were being collected in that 10-year period via digital footage that was being collected. In the first 80 days of the war in Ukraine, 10 years of footage was being collected. Now, the amount of data and content that we're collecting out of Ukraine is beyond our human capacity to understand. It is overwhelming and makes it inordinately difficult to follow what we're seeing when we're looking at our devices. And this is creating this overwhelming amount of information and data is creating all sorts of challenges in terms of managing attention. And just to get this point out early on, I think it's fair to say that one of the things that all three panelists observed was that actually our capacity as citizens in the European Union, in the UK, it's fallen off. We're not actually paying as much attention to what's going on in Ukraine as we once were, maybe when we were initially shocked by that invasion in the first couple of days. And I remember very well talking to people some of whom were in tears actually about seeing what was happening defy the lessons of history, as it were. The story that's the exact opposite of what Caro was saying earlier. Of course, the devices that are making it possible for us to see the world and capturing enormous quantities of data are our smartphones. We have zettabytes of data. The internet will be zettabytes in the next few years. That's why we are seeing so much imagery. I mean, I never would have thought, and I can't believe anyone here would have ever thought that they would be able to see directly on their phones artillery fire being adjusted via a drone that was driven and powered by a smartphone, and that fire adjustment would happen, and then it would be broadcast, having been recorded by a headquarters, a battalion headquarters, brigade headquarters, and then broadcast for the purposes of advertising the unit's prowess at capacity to destroy the enemy. And the smartphone, it has its very, very unique affordances. It allows you to produce, publish, and consume media all from one device. And that really is creating all sorts of situations in which, certainly in the early stages of the war in Ukraine, people could actively participate in the war in a way that they'd never previously been able to. So in that respect, people could record an advancing Russian column and then upload that information so that a Ukrainian brigade could use that data to target advancing Russians. And that really has broken down a relationship. This technology, the smartphone technology, has embedded some changes in patterns of participation in warfare. And I think today, of all days, is October the 7th. I kind of feel the need to broaden out the scope of some of this conversation before we get back to a conversation about Sweden and the challenges facing Sweden in relation to all things digital, how to digitally mobilize society for war, as much as to how to prepare society for the very, very real challenges of actually paying for a conventional war. So today, of course, is the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack on southern Israel, which resulted in an enormous number of atrocities happening all over southern Israel. The one that will come to mind over the next few months as the documentary gets released across different parts of Europe is the attack on the dance festival, the Nova Dance Festival, which involved an enormous number of Israelis just basically harvesting all their smartphone footage and combining that into a documentary. So you could see the unfolding terror occurring, and you'll see that over an hour-and-a-half documentary. It's really rather horrific, but it's an important watch because it tells you something about how smartphone devices are being used in war zones. And that really is something that I'd like to emphasize here as a sort of bridge to the next panel. Because the smartphone doesn't just work independently. It's part of a much broader set of communication infrastructures, civilian, but also in parallel military communication infrastructures. And Hamas were very, very carefully planning, using open source information, of course, the sort of things that you and I take for granted when we're looking at our smartphone, using that, plus using other sources, Google Earth. And of course, a border is not a fixed or hard border, especially when Israelis themselves are relying on people working from crossing the border into southern Israel and working in Israel. So you could collect a lot of different sources of information to understand how the smart wall, this is the wall that divided southern Israel from Gaza, how the smart wall worked, and then the sets of challenges that Hamas would face as they advanced out across, once they'd broken through the smart wall and sought to spread atrocity. And I put it to you that really the Hamas attack was very, very, very sophisticated. That the goal was to buy time so that they could spread more atrocity and broadcast more atrocity. And the goal in that respect was to slow down the Israeli Defense Forces' response time by attacking Israeli military infrastructure, whilst leaving civilian infrastructure in place so that the Israelis themselves could broadcast terror all over. And the goal then was about how do we increase the window from a few hours to 8 hours or more, so that we can increase the amount of time where we can operate without the Israeli Defense Forces responding. Now, if you take my analysis seriously, that there's something very telling in there for us in terms of not just understanding a smartphone, but also the information communication infrastructures that make that possible. And they are the things, it seems to me, that where we are now having to concern ourselves, because those technologies shape information flows. Those technologies shape what we can know and understand at any one time. They are the things that are framing whether our populations engage with the realities of war or disengage from that. They also transform the battle space. So the battle space is no longer just something immediately in the here and now where you are having a fight with your adversary on a battlefield. The people with their smartphones are, of course, broadcasting live, sometimes depending on the electromagnetic spectrum, depending on levels of connectivity. And anyone, anywhere in the world, can, of course, repost that material and then engage in the amplification of the violence that we're seeing. So we have a very, very changed dynamic, if you will, where people can participate both kinetically but also in terms of propaganda. Now, and we can see that very clearly, it seems to me, in terms of the attack against Hezbollah on September 17th. Smart technology became something that Sheikh Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was very, very concerned by. The smartphone being a sensor. Effectively, you are carrying around something that can be militarized and can transmit data about you and what you do, your pattern of life, and of course can also be used to help identify who you're talking to, what your networks are, and all the rest of it. Now, this campaign that Israel mounted is clearly inordinately sophisticated, not something you can do easily, but the way the campaign unfolded against Hezbollah, and more recently, killing the senior leadership and all the way down through the middle leadership in a targeted operation that involved initially getting everyone off their smartphone and then using second generation, third generation technologies like pagers as a way of shaping military operations is also something to concern ourselves with, I think. My suggestion really is that in terms of future war, we are in a realm where our smartphones our smart devices allow us to participate in war in a way that has never previously been possible. And that becomes a vector around which both our attention and engagement in war is being shaped, but also puts us in a position in which the smartphone becomes part of a much broader way in which wars are conducted. They become devices that enable warfare to occur as well. And this is something that I would like to foreground, principally because, as you all are aware, maybe some of you are looking at your smartphones now, this is the thing that we need to be aware of as we start to think about digital mobilization of Sweden itself. There we go.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I invite Kristin Ljungqvist, Associate Professor of War Studies at Swedish Defense University, Hanna Lindestål, the CEO at Earhart Business Protection Agency, Carl Fredrik Wettermark, the Senior Director at the National Security Council, and Joachim Paasikivi, Independent Defense Analyst, to take their seats. In this panel, we will touch upon several parts of the digital battlefields of the future, the effect of the digitalization on total defense, the role of private technology in war, the impact of artificial intelligence, and the military aspect of technologies. All participants will start with a 5-minute remark to share their thoughts and expertise before discussing issues. And with that, Christine, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Is my working? So in my current research, I'm looking into the ongoing remobilization of the Swedish total defense. And I want to, in relation to this, point to a couple of challenges that I see with the future total defense. And in this whole context of remobilizing the Swedish total defense, I mean, the lessons learned from Ukraine has obviously taken a very central stage, not least when it comes to digital battlefields. And I think also, especially in relation to what is often described as this ongoing Russian hybrid war against Europe and against Sweden, with disinformation, for example, polluted information, disruptive communication, and fake news. All of this is causing a great deal of information management anxiety, I think, among Swedish public authorities right now. And with regards to the lessons learned in Ukraine, we have seen, especially during the first couple of months in Ukraine, we saw this deep fascination and I would say admiration in Europe and in Sweden with the Ukrainian resistance, this fantastic mobilization of the Ukrainian population, I would say especially the general population. And that was, anything from the fact that the average Ukrainian would go into their living room liquor cabinet and mix up a Molotov cocktail and throw out their kitchen window on a bypassing Russian tank, but it's also very much in relation to the digital battlefield and digital resistance, where we have seen a lot of innovative participation through their smartphone, anything from crowdsourcing, intelligence sharing, and as Matt also talked about, how people have used their smartphone to geolocate Russian tanks, send off this information, even through governmental apps, to send this information to the Ukrainian armed forces, and thereby also taking a direct sort of, or participating directly in the targeting in the kill chain, basically in the war. And I mean, this is the ideal picture of a total defense, with the whole population sort of mobilizing and taking part. Now, in the remobilization of the Swedish total defense, if we look at the biggest differences that we had in the old version, so to say, during the Cold War, I think that this information context that we're living in now is probably one of the biggest differences in relation to context. So in the old total defense, the whole idea was basically that the total defense would only be activated in case of an imminent or actual attack on Sweden, whereby the government would put the country in a heightened state of alert. But since we're living now in a context of an constantly ongoing hybrid war, with all of these information attacks, disruptive communication, fake news, we need to build a total defense that is can be active on a day-to-day basis. And this is a quite challenging thing for the total defense, because we're still living with the old legal structure where we need to put the country in a heightened state of alert. So that's one challenge. And that leads me into the second challenge, and that is, what's the role of the population in this new total defense when we live in this context of ongoing hybrid attacks on an everyday basis? I mean, civilians, the population at large, has always been a very central component in a total defense. That's the whole idea. A total war is directed towards the population, and a total defense requires a broad societal mobilization. I mean, active resistance in a total defense is actually required by law from everyone, not necessarily by arms, but you need to make an effort in the total defense.
So this participatory war is sort of at the core of total defense already. However, in the old version, this active resistance would only be sort of deemed necessary in case of a heightened state of alert. And now we need a total defense that can be active on a daily basis. So the question is, what can we expect from the population in terms of this hybrid ongoing war? Well, I mean, we do see that the population is constantly targeted with disruptive communication, fake news. We could actually argue that in this new total defense, we want this active participation from the entire population through their smartphone, which has become a weapon. So, I mean, even if it's only on mundane everyday activities like scrolling on your phone and checking your social media, but we do want this active participation, which requires very high levels of media literacy among the population. It requires really high capacity for source criticism. And one of the most important challenges, I think, in case of an actual traditional kinetic war, you do want this active participation and resistance from your population. The problem is that when you as an individual geotag a Russian tank and send it off to your army, you will be a legitimate target of war, according to the laws of armed conflict. And this is the awareness about this, I think, is very low. I think it has been a problem also in Ukraine, and we have many occasions where Russian soldiers have actually killed civilians for just picking up their phone, because you might have this app where you can locate a Russian tank. And that is not necessarily a crime against that, or that could be in line with the laws of armed conflict in actually doing this. So that is, I think, some of the challenges I see with building up the new Swedish total defense and what we have to deal with.
Thank you so much, Christine. Hanna?
Just agree. No. Well, I'm looking into cyber espionage and cyber attacks against civil society, and I've been looking a lot at what's going on in Ukraine. And the digital warfare is fundamentally changing the landscape of global conflict. The ongoing war in Ukraine has proven with us that it's given us invaluable insights in how digital espionage against civil society actually got an impact. We have seen espionage against mobile phones. We have seen app with geolocations being downloaded in a costume of being another type of app, maybe a shopping app, what do I know? And the data is being used for artillery fire, it's being used for missile attacks, and it's being used for drones. So our personal devices have suddenly been a part of the war. And I'm really glad you mentioned that just when you geotag someone, you can actually be a participant in the war. And we haven't thought about that yet. We are witnessing a paradigm shift when it comes to digital espionage. We have gone from systems where you spy in systems, we're using complex methods to do surveillance in digital systems, till today, where we see actors producing new apps, new systems that you and I download with the purpose of espionage, but it looks like a normal shopping app or a fun game or something else. And we haven't adapted to that yet. The app stores hasn't adapted to that yet, and some of these apps are being widely spread over the internet through other channels. Espionage is picking flowers and making honey with AI today. So all the data we provide is going vastly forward with AI. 10 years ago, we could use some big data handling. Today, it's a matter of your next breath when the AI can produce a suggestion on a good strategy based on knowledge from thousands and thousands and thousands of data points from thousands and thousands of people. And we live in Sweden. We live in a country that is loving development, loving technology. Everything should be digitalized. And of course, we're going to use the cheapest product. So that's going to be one of the challenges when it comes to creating preparedness in our own country, is that we need to think about who is the producer of the system, what is the system actually meant for, and we have to be a little bit more digitally paranoid. Looking ahead, cyber espionage will become even more sophisticated and more pervasive. We see state-sponsored actors that are really active, but we also see private sector are evolving, and we see the AI is being used as a generator. We got Fraud GPT. I don't know if you've seen the Chat GPT is a pretty fun tool. I mean, the Fraud GPT is even more fun because it can actually produce harmful code for you. You see warm GPT, that's another tool on the dark side of the internet where you actually can produce harmful data that you can use later for attacking by yourself. And that's also knowledge that we see from Ukraine. The actors in the cyber wars are not only state-sponsored or organized, there are a huge bunch of people engaging on all sides, doing everything, and some things are really successful and some things are really, really harmful. And that's a scary development. The rise of cybercrime as a service we see is actually increasing in the war in Europe, and we see that many actors are using ransomware services out there because it's much easier and it's quicker. We see AI is like digital warfare on steroids, and that's the future I'm worrying about. So I want to conclude this, that Russia is heavily investing in AI. And they want autonomous system for modernizing the military. They want AI for missile systems, for artillery, for drone systems. But we also got other actors that are actually even more active and are in the outburst of this, and it's China. China view AI as critical to future military and economic power. It's developing AI-controlled weapon system, including autonomous drones and warships, but they're also using espionage in a level we've never seen before. And it's a country in the world that's driving the development to actually create systems with the purpose to gather information. And it's not only the app in your phone, it could also be an industrial system. This development also raises ethical and strategical concerns, I think, because we are seeing a development of autonomous system that actually going to make the decision in war based on my personal data on who's going to live and who's going to die. And the human doesn't have the say in the matter. And that's worrisome.
Yeah. So let's leave humanity, and I'll hand over to Carl Fredrik, who will probably touch upon AI.
Thank you. Well, I was given that task, talk about AI. I feel that's a little bit like talking about the internet in 1999 and giving some level of prognosis of how it's going to affect things. I remember back then, some people were thinking the internet was a fluke. Some people were underestimating how it would impact the global system. Nobody really took it seriously until about, well, I guess when Facebook hit, to be honest. I don't think we've seen the Facebook moment yet when it comes to AI. I think what we saw in the last year or so with what's been made public from the big foundation factories is a bit of a taste of what is going to become a very revolutionary change for most parts of our society. It is difficult to break down the question. I thought I'd structure it in terms of different layers of conflict that we're seeing now. Of course, conflict will be changed by AI. What we've seen now is this very predictable drop in public discussion about AI. You might have noticed it. Everyone talked about AI during the spring. Now nobody talks about AI. This happens for every single technology. There's a discussion about how it will impact the world, and there's a slight delay, and then nobody talks about it anymore. There's even a name for this. This is a consultancy company called Gartner. It does a chart, which is the inflated peak of expectations, and then you drop down to the trough of disappointment, and then you end up in what I think we're now in, where AI will start actually changing things very, very quickly in very many domains at the same time. The ones that we're talking about mostly is, of course, operationally, what will happen to autonomous drones. But I think it's also cyber warfare. That's one thing. But almost every aspect of conflict will change. intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, strategy. There is no reason to think that military strategists will be better than AI at making military strategy in the coming years, nor better than intelligence analysts, nor better than anyone else. They're already better than brain surgeons. They should be able to beat most officers at military and tactical planning. And this is really what this race is about on the operational side. But there are other dimensions to it as well. You know, on the resource side, we're seeing more or less all-out war for the key components and creating constraints between adversaries for what is creating the prerequisites for AI development when it comes to chips, when it comes to software, when it comes to well, pretty much, you know, every part of the whole value chain. That is being very much undermined by the fact that AI is now no longer a closed enterprise. Most of it is free. Most of the models are, you know, the lag between the best open source models and the best closed source models is now just 4 months. That means that closed source is not going to cut it. We're not going to be able to isolate ourselves and innovate ourselves in a closed ecosystem. The key to some level of AI dominance is open innovation. And here Sweden is actually well situated. We have one of the best innovation ecosystems in the world. We're good when it comes to open innovation. So this is really the key, you know, embracing the fact that this is a platform where the innovator has the advantage. So that's the resource part of it. There's another dimension which I don't think is often seen, which is the normative side of it. You know, people talk about the EU AI Act and regulation. Well, that's happening in a lot of different spaces at the same time. We're seeing regulatory effects and initiatives in you know, states in the US, Council of Europe, United Nations, well, EU of course, but also in regional groupings. I think what is key though is that we're only seeing these touching the civilian side of AI. When it comes to the core military side of AI, we're already past the point when this will be an easy thing to regulate. It is a situation which is very similar to what cybersecurity was in the mid-90s, when there was initial discussions about trying to forge global consensus and some level of global acceptance for basic rules when it came to cyber tools. This then kind of split, so you had a very strict and very militaristic and very security-oriented discussion in First Committee in the UN, and then the rest of the world tried to kind of move on with a development narrative around new technologies when it came to cybersecurity. I think the same thing is happening to AI now. So I think one of the major questions is, are we going to be able to forge some level of international consensus around the most crucial security aspects of AI or not? And there are some international initiatives to this effect. The Brits have been doing some work. There was a summit last year in Bletchley Park on this issue, but we're still in a very, very nascent space. And the AI development is, if you haven't looked at what's been happening over the past few months, then you know, this pace of change is so dramatic that it is very difficult to keep up, even for people who are looking at the AI technological development on a daily basis. So I think this is the problem here, is like, I think it was easier making predictions about the internet in '99 than it is to make predictions about where AI will be going in the next 2 years. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carl Fredrik. Joachim.
Well, in the last panel we heard that several people weren't economists, and I can't start enumerating all the things that I'm not. I mean, being comfortable here is one of them. So I asked my son before coming here, I mean, what am I going to say? And he said, yeah, well, that's easy, quote something from the Matrix. So that's what I'll do. Neo says, I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. And by doing so, I'd like just to revisit the early years of this millennium, when we in Sweden started talking about network-based defense. That was the thing. And when we start looking at the technologies that were advanced as ideas then, with aerostats and integrated links with information being shared, then we see that this is coming to fruition now, to some extent, in Ukraine. So the lead time between these great ideas and the implementations of those seem to be about 20 years. And I think that looking back, many of these, really just, next door things that we have just across the threshold tend to take some time. And yes, I agree that AI is advancing at a fairly rapid pace, but nevertheless, there are some things to consider. And I was fortunate enough to be at another event where we had Chatham House rules, so I can't say when and where and who it was. It wasn't me, certainly, who said that AI in its current state is a solution looking for a problem. Inasmuch as it's very much tech-driven, and it's not quite certain that what the useful, where the utility is in all aspects. Yeah, it can do neat things, but it's still hallucinating. I mean, it comes up with stuff that isn't real. That might be kind of a drawback. So yes, it'll take decisions, but those decisions have to be implemented by something, and that thing has to exist. And what we've seen now in Ukraine, and which has made it painfully clear to us that we need to have things that we know that we're going to use in case of a war. For instance, artillery ammunition. It's quite good to have, as well as medical supplies and air defense and all these fairly tangible things. And the other experience is that it's quite apparent from Ukraine as well, and the example is drones, but it's not the thing that's important, it's the process. So we need to implement some kind of mindset where we have, on the one hand, heavy industry producing a lot at a fairly high cost, where the risk is shared between industry and government. Orders, build new factories, do stuff, get things. And on the other hand, we need to have less rules, less bureaucracy, which means that the process from idea to product or implementation of whatever is significantly shorter. And that's what we've seen with drones in Ukraine. Will AI help with this? Yes, possibly. But then the same knowledgeable person said that there's a significant risk that AI in its current state is the next IT bubble. Which means that, yes, internet did come and internet changed the world, but all the companies went bankrupt in the meantime. So then the question is, will there be a glitch, and how will that influence things? And when we look at all these fantastic things, and I like the example now with the not quite mature technology that was apparent in over the skies of Ukraine, day before yesterday, was it? The Su-57 that shot down its own trial drone, the loyal wingman, the Ochotnik drone. So for those of you who doesn't follow Twitter or X every waking minute, you might have missed it. But there's a film clip of a fighter with an aircraft in front of it, and the fighter jet shoots down that drone because apparently the information that we have now is that it lost contact or something. And they shot down their own most advanced drone, which is apparently made in 4 prototypes. And they shot it down in order for it not to fall in Ukrainian hands, which it immediately did because it crashed in Ukraine. So technology is good. AI, yes, it'll become certainly smarter than me, but we will still have people implementing all of these things and taking decisions to implement AI Otherwise, we're in Terminator, another movie. And then there's a question of getting killed by systems or things that are AI-driven. Is that a huge problem? I mean, it's in retrospect, it will be to find out who's responsible. But for the individual getting killed, I don't need a personal engagement with the people killing me. So if it's the programmer, if it's a decision maker, I think that problem it's more academic than real, at least at the battlefield.
Thank you, Joachim. If I start with you, the Pentagon has estimated in about 10 years, remotely piloted aircraft will make up the majority of the US Air Force. If you look at the battlefield today, perhaps Sweden, how far have we come when it comes to automatization? Will you see pilotless Griffins in the sky in 10 years?
How far I'm the wrong man to try to assess that, because I've been here for 3 years and I've been in another learning institution for the 3 previous years. So I'm not a practitioner in that way. But my personal view is that how far have we come? 50 centimeters? I mean, and we are so backwards. I think that some of the industry people have very good ideas and are implementing this. But is there a Swedish customer? I'm not sure. I mean, we discussed beforehand, I mean, the Swedish Armed Forces were buying Chinese drones instead of Swedish-made because they're cheaper. So we're still in the mindset that, well, the drone is a small aircraft and not a piece of ammunition, because we haven't realized that yet. And we're buying cheap stuff because we're idiots. So I don't have huge confidence in our developmental sense of being at the forefront of development. We have the neuron, or the neuron, I don't know if it was supposed to be pronounced in French or Anglicized Swedish, the co-production of a drone between us and the French, I think, which didn't come to anything. So, yeah, well, I think we'll let the big boys play with those things.
Hannah, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I want to answer because we had a really good discussion before, and I'm so sad I couldn't broadcast it afterwards. If we want to build ability and a robust country, one thing we can learn from Ukraine is building their own ability to create stuff. They have 3D printers in the front. They have factories producing their own drones. And as you said, I'm becoming really sad when I see the development in Sweden. We are trying to build a preparedness system where we're buying stuff from far, far, far away, and you can't rely on that source in case of a conflict. When we do have like 10, 15 companies in Sweden producing new drone systems, but they don't get any clients because it's kind of expensive to have a company in Sweden. So if you want to build a robust country, maybe we need to invest in our own systems sometimes.
Kristin, you mentioned the idea of total defense is to mobilize everyone. And the role of the population, we want an active population, perhaps on social media. You mentioned the risk with, in the future, civilians will be seen as combatants, and we've seen Russia target civilians, knowing they're civilians, not using this e-enemy app that Ukraine has brought forward. Have you seen discussions or perhaps already a solution to, will we have to define bigger parts, what the civilian population is in a different way in the future when a smartphone can be seen as a weapon?
In the Swedish context, I have seen, I would say, I'm actually worried that I've seen so little discussion on this. I have tried for the past 2 years to read every lessons learned report that is coming out from Ukraine from various public agencies in Sweden, and I think I have seen at one place in one report that the issue that maybe this is a potential problem, that we have this governmental app where people can send in this information, geotag, locate Russian tanks. Maybe those who actually do this are not, aware that this is actually making them a legitimate target of war.
So I think it's a bit worrisome that I have seen so little discussion on this in the Swedish discourse on the reestablishment of total defense. But at the same time, you see most of these reports, lessons learned report, spent a lot of time talking about this active participation of the the civilian population. And in many, I mean, not just digital resistance, but that's a big part of it, but also in terms of, anything from crowdsourcing, but also, women and children knitting camouflage nets or whatever, that the entire population. But I think that this is an aspect that is quite overlooked.
Carl Fredrik, you mentioned there's been a Facebook moment for AI yet, and I have to ask you, what do you think that Facebook moment will be? But also, is AI a solution right now looking for a problem, or do you see it's more experimental? Or you mentioned Sweden as an innovation ecosystem for this. How is Sweden compared to other countries, perhaps not China or the US, but are we a leader in AI?
I would say that I don't see it as a solution looking for a problem at least not on the civilian side. I think what we have a problem with on the Swedish side is too big of a division between what's happening on the civilian innovation side and the military innovation side. There have been government initiatives on defense innovation to try to bridge these, but traditionally we've had a venture capital community and a startup community that has been very driven and forward-leaning in adopting to new technologies. And we want to make sure that that part of the innovative landscape in Sweden is contributing to defense broadly as well. I don't think I can say what the Facebook moment is going to be, but what I can say is that, there are constant small revolutions happening in the AI space, and we're at a point now where the pace of development is becoming exponential. You're seeing AI that are better than humans at conducting AI research, or AI that is better at designing AI chips, or better at training AI models. And that is, of course, the start of a very, very quick development curve. So it's very difficult at this point to say exactly what that output is going to be. Now, it's true that most of the capital for AI investment is locked into the earlier stages of the supply chain, chips, data centers, data. But that was the case for the internet as well. Most people back in the 90s, they invested in telco providers because they thought that was the future of the internet. And perhaps some of the companies that we're seeing now are the telco companies of AI development. So it's very difficult to say what are the innovations that are going to come out of this. But some companies will live, some bubble, some. It's also very difficult to talk about AI as a complete whole. There are massive differences and many nuances in it. We can't equate the AI field with one particular type of large language model, which has become almost a part of the daily discourse now. And many of the things that were issues that are still floating around 6 months ago are not issues anymore with AI. So I think it's hard to say if we will be reaching a Facebook moment. I think I had one the other day with Notebook LLM from Google, if someone has tried that. If you haven't tried it, generate a podcast and see whether or not you can figure out whether it's a real one or not. It's free of charge.
Hannah, if we just mention deterrence quickly, and some experts say NATO deterrence is working. We haven't had a kinetic attack from Russia or a tank rolling into NATO territory, but we do see hybrid warfare and cyber attacks. From your perspective, dealing with cyber issues, do you see an effective deterrence? Probably not. Or can you see a possible deterrence being built up? How do we protect ourselves? Can we?
Well, we did actually expect Russia to be more aggressive in the cybersphere. We haven't seen the large-scale attacks. We have been seeing what we call advanced persistent threats, attacks going on for a very, very long time. You shouldn't underestimate all the cyber attacks that are going on in all of Europe and all of the countries, but especially we see in Sweden that are not ever going to be mentioned, because when you're hit by a cyber attack, you're not going to go out and say, well, actually our system is down and our client's data is stolen, because that hurts. So there's a big number of organizations that are being hacked regularly that not talk about it. So there are a lot of attacks. So we see it's increasing, and that's where I see AI doing a really effective work. I'm not going to say good work, but an effective work. AI-generated cyber attacks are really cheap and really effective. Today we see, I mentioned Fraud GPT. It's actually an AI platform to create, for example, automated systematic phishing mails for authorities, where you use your personal data that are stored on the internet to create the perfect email for you that you're going to click on. And suddenly you're going to be participating in the cyber attack. So we do see they are increasing knowledge and they are adapting to new technology. But the development in the cybersphere, where we have several countries in the world that are really good in cyber attacks, but we have more freelancers out there that are better when it comes to cyber proxies that are selling their service to governments, to organizations for money.
Yeah. Joachim, if we look at conflict, usually if you look at Ukraine, Russia, and cyber, the digitalization of warfare, do you see that as has it had a major part? Do you see a switch now when it comes to conflict, that it's more digital?
I think that, I mean, Ukraine showed that it was less digital than we'd thought. And certainly we'll have to be good at reading paper maps again, because we don't know when the systems will go down. But I think that the important discussion with AI is whether the next war will be Sun Tzu, winning the war before an armed conflict, or it's still Clausewitz. I've read the books. I just want to say, reluctantly, but still, with the decisive battle. I mean, will we still fight wars? And I think the answer, regardless of AI, will be yes. And then the question then is to what extent will AI help us do better tactics and stuff? But war is, in essence, about large-scale killing of people. And will AI make us get away from that? Well, it might be some kind of hope, but I don't think so. I think we'll still end up killing people to a large extent, and I just hope that we don't do it with these man-made suns that the Americans invented to stop the Second World War.
Just finishing this panel, we've talked a lot about civilians and combatants, the legal frameworks of AI. From your expertise, with Russia being Russia, with China moving in that direction, do you see a legal framework concerning AI, concerning civilians, when it comes to technology, when it comes to cyber attacks? Is there any sunshine being able to create a legal framework, or has that time completely passed from our history?
I don't know. I think it's way too early to say anything about that, because it's we don't really know what we're dealing with yet. And in terms of coming back to your question before on the civilians and how can we think about that in terms of the legal structure of total defense? First of all, you have to have an acknowledgement that it's actually a problem to begin with, and I don't think that we're even there yet. So I think it's way too early to talk about.
Anna?
I think it's a question we need to discuss. For example, if I work in a bank in Moscow during the day and during the night I'm hacking critical infrastructure in Ukraine, am I a soldier in war or am I a civilian? We need to discuss these issues, everything from geopointing location of tanks to participating actively in the hybrid sphere in cybercrime. Who's the combatant? The discussion is not on the table today, but it should be.
Frederick?
I mean, there are discussions. We have the discussions on loss of autonomous weapon systems. There are discussions on use of ICTs for international security in First Committee. There are initiatives that are taking place also specifically on AI, but forging a global consensus on it is, as I mentioned, very, very difficult, especially at a time when there is a lot of conflict. It is difficult when times are not this difficult or this tense, of course, it is going to be a massive effort to try to push something through on a global scale through a multilateral organization. But what I can see is regional initiatives developing for regulating AI and also industry initiatives.
Joachim?
Well, what he said, but seeing that the regional initiatives that we have talked about earlier, constraining us or building restraints, have hampered the Western way of war. It's landmines, it's missiles, it's all kinds of stuff that we decided that they were too nasty, so we got rid of them. The enemy didn't.
Thank you so much for participating in this panel. An enormous thanks to all our participants, for all of you who joined us here and followed us online. A special thanks to Dara and Jack, who traveled here from abroad to participate. Thank you to the Swedish Defence University for hosting this together with us. And thank you yet again to all who came here to Sverigesalen to listen to this seminar. Thank you.